Welcome, everybody. This is live from the field, Climate Change in Our Watershed.
First of all, to do a prescribed fire, a lot of planning has to take place first. So it can take a very long time to go through the process to plan, to get permits, to get all your resources there, and make sure you have, plan A, plan B, plan C, you have all your emergency information there. And so with that in place, a good fire that jumps over its boundaries should be handled very quickly and be contained very quickly, as long as you have the right resources there. And you also need to be willing to decide on the morning of that the conditions just aren't right. So you can do a lot of planning, have 50 people show up to your burn, and then say, today's just not right. The wind is going to be too much, or the fuels are too dry. And so in that way, you can prevent a good fire from becoming a bad fire.
Thank you for that. This next question is for Mike. And this one is, let me make sure I have it right. At what rate does bioplastic break down? And what is the final product after breaking down? Is there anything that could be useful to humans or the environment?
Good question. And this particular bioplastic, there's different kinds. This PLA is for polylactic acid. That's the same lactic acid that's in yogurt. It's just a small 3-carbon molecule, and they just link it together in an orderly fashion. So when it breaks down, some of you might know the term hydrolysis, breaking apart water across the bond, just releases lactic acid into the environment. Now, out in the world here, even in our system on the tables, it's the lactic acid won't last long. There's a lot of microbes that degrade lactic acid, and we'll use that as a carbon source, basically turn it into carbon dioxide, goes right back into the atmosphere. So that is really what you want to have happen, the stuff to disintegrate completely. As Belle said, we're just looking to use the high pH that the cyanobacteria generate to initiate degradation, and then get it into the composters. And we're looking to speed up that process, because I think it's been made clear that it is way too slow right now. Even though technically it's compostable, it's labeled compostable, it's much too slow to be practical. Most composting facilities, the vast majority, cannot accept it. In fact, there's one down the street here, Pelham Hill Road, that they put some in, but what was that, October 2019, and it's still intact. So they won't accept PLA anymore. So the idea is just get it to where it can be composted and disintegrated. True composting is you don't recognize it at the end. It becomes part of that material.
Great. Okay, we have another question for Anne. How do fires affect water resources?
So in a lot of different ways, severe wildfire can, even in the wildlands, in urban areas, obviously you can burn things that are toxic if they run off the following winter and get into your waterways. And in wildlands, especially on steep slopes, a severe fire can really cook your soils. And so those soils become hydrophobic. And instead of those rains coming the following winter, instead of them soaking into the soils, they are repelled by those soils. Depending on the vegetation in the soil and the slope, they can result in a lot of ash and debris flowing downhill into your waterways. That can affect fish habitat, it can affect water quality, and it can impact, one of the things that we're concerned about is it affecting the sands and gravels in the Russian River that we depend on to filter our drinking water. So we use riverbank filtration. The sands and gravels do a great job of filtering out E. coli and other things that we're concerned about. And we think that ash and sediment dumping into the system could really impact that. So that's why fire ends up being a water issue. So we've started exploring all sorts of different partnerships with different agencies to look for solutions. And our partners are our neighbors in the Lake Sonoma Watershed as well.
Wow. Yeah, everything is connected. Here we have a question for Mike. Now, Belle already kind of touched on this, but you might have more to add. How effective is bioenergy and can it be commercialized or widely produced?
Well, so bioenergy already, especially the kind I would just describe in the video about anaerobic digestion, that's widely used. In fact, if you're flushing your toilet at home and you're in the Santa Rosa Watershed, it's going to the Santa Rosa Laguna treatment plant, and they use the solids for generating bioenergy, basically biomethane, and that powers about a third of the plant's energy requirements, which is a lot because moving water, as you know, anyone who's carried water is really takes a lot of energy, and so moving all the water around that system, they can use all the bioenergy they can gather. So that form of bioenergy is widely used, and really, others are, in under research, like biohydrogen and things like that. That's really not ready yet for wide scale use, or it hasn't been employed so much. But some things are more promising and research level right now.
We have another question for Anne. Do the detriments of logging outweigh the benefits?
Logging is such a big question, and logging is really about the details, the devil's in the details, so to speak. So the logging of yesteryear that just caused tons of erosion and dumped soil and hillsides into rivers. Northern California has been hit hard by really irresponsible logging in the past. The kind of vegetation management that people are looking at now, organizations like UC Cooperative Extension and the Resource Conservation Districts and others, is really finding locations where, for example, you have oak woodlands that are being invaded by Douglas fir trees. Taking fire off a landscape can result in invasion of other plants that wouldn't normally be there. So our oak woodlands are looking a lot more like Douglas fir forests than they should, than they used to. And so if you see your oak woodland getting invaded by small Doug firs, and you start pulling out those Doug firs that are, really small still, seedlings, and maybe, a couple of inches thick at kind of the DBH, the diameter, then you're going to restore your oak woodlands. If you do it responsibly, you can do it without causing erosion. You can use grazing to manage some of the species, some of the invasive plants that come and invade oak woodlands and grasslands and shrublands. And that's a way to do things that are restoration, so kind of ecological restoration. And I think that's really a good pathway for moving forward in terms of restoring our natural ecosystems, removing or at least reducing cover of non-native plants that are invading, and then fire fuel reduction. And then once you take those, small Doug firs that are invading your oak woodland out, then the trees that remain end up growing more and sequestering more carbon. And so there's this kind of feedback loop. And then if you do a prescribed burn and continue managing the understory, and a big fire does come through, then your remaining trees are healthier and they survive that fire, and it's much less likely to become a severe wildfire.
So and the prescribed burn can help prevent the Douglas firs from getting established in the first place if it's done early enough. Is that right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. A prescribed fir or a prescribed fire can help control young Doug firs that are invading a landscape.
And you mentioned you're volunteering for an organization. Is that something that you have a link to that you could put in the chat?
Yes. I can do that, and I would love to mention them. They're called Audubon Canyon Ranch. They have a site in the Glen Ellen area and also in Marin and a few other preserves in the area, and they are great about training people to become wildland firefighters and volunteers like me. And they are fantastic. The person who runs their Fire Forward program is named Sasha Berleman, and she has a PhD in fire ecology. So she's not only a firefighter, but she's also an ecologist, and is really looking at this as a tool to manage landscapes to make it healthier. She's got a huge team there, and they're all working on, ecological benefits of this as one of the tools that we need to use moving forward. So they're called Audubon Canyon Ranch, and I can send out a link.
Thank you.
That would be great. Yeah, thanks for talking to each other. You guys can ask each other questions. That's totally great. Jump on in if you have something to reply to. And just ironically, the next question in the chat, you've covered some of this, and is how impactful are the prescribed fires, and have you seen a major decrease in Doug fir infestation?
I think there are a lot of people collecting data to answer those questions. I know personally somebody who lost their home in the glass fire in kind of east of Santa Rosa, and they have done a lot of thinning, very responsible conservation thinning on the property, pulling out young Doug firs, etc. We have done several, well, at least prescribed burn in that area. And when the glass fire came through, it really left that area alone in terms of that prescribed burn, the burn unit. And so I don't have a lot of data or statistics at this point, because I think the sample size is pretty small. But anecdotally, at least, it really looks like that area where there was a prescribed burn didn't burn maybe at all, but at least if it did burn, it was a much less severe burn than the surrounding areas where a lot of homes were lost. There have been other studies in the Sierras and elsewhere looking at different treatment options and how they survived different large-scale fires. And some of the treatments that looked the most promising were thinning followed by prescribed burns or pile burns. So you have to, once you do a little thinning, you're left with all this biomass. And then what do you do with that biomass? And one of the questions is, one, can you create biochar or something that can then be used to sequester carbon into the soil? And if you can't, can you burn piles of this material, or take it off site, do a prescribed burn on site, or remove that biomass from the site. Anyway, so there are some people studying this issue and looking for solutions to figure out, what actually works. We like to talk about ideas about what may or may not work, but it's really important to look at the data to see what does work, because all of these efforts are really expensive and time intensive.
We have another question, which is, how can you get trained to be a prescribed burn practitioner?
That's a great question. Audubon Canyon Ranch's Fire Forward program is a great place to start. They have been conducting a lot of trainings over the last, a couple of years. I was trained maybe 2 years ago or so, and there are constantly new trainings being scheduled, and they love taking more volunteers and one of the barriers to getting this work done is that there hasn't really been a trained workforce yet. And so workforce development is a really big issue, and you can get trained through that program and do the same thing I do, and maybe I'll see you on the fire line.
This next question goes to Mike. What is the process used to determine whether or not an algae or bacteria will break down plastic?
Well, so the kind of plastic we're working with, this polylactic acid, is subject to degradation in alkaline conditions, basic conditions. And we know we can just put it into something that's very high pH, like sodium hydroxide, and it will dissolve over time. What we're doing is, instead of relying on some chemical means that wouldn't be really practical on a large scale, is to just use the power of photosynthetic microorganisms. And the nice thing about it is that basically, when you see pond scum or some some kind of mat on a shallow body of water, that's generating in the process of photosynthesis a lot of alkalinity. The water gets very basic. We reach up at about pH 11, which some of you will know that's pretty high. And it doesn't have to be a particular, of course, we inoculated with one that just does well. What we did was we chose one, of course, only needs CO2 for carbon, right? Photosynthesizing. But we also chose one that fixes nitrogen from the air. It doesn't require nitrogen fertilizer. So you don't have to put that into the water. It can just get its nitrogen from the air. But as I said, over the course of the year, it might get displaced by another organism, which is just fine, because that one will invariably be a photosynthesizer too, relying on the sun. And as long as we keep the environment where we want it, it doesn't really matter what particular organism goes there. We always start with a guess, but then it'll go in whatever direction it wants to go.
Another question for Anne is, how is the wildlife affected by controlled fires?
That's a great question. So we as government agencies, whenever we do anything that could impact wildlife or other natural resources, we need to do a lot of environmental compliance. And so whenever my organization, we haven't done our own prescribed burn yet, but I think we will. Whenever we or regional parks or other organizations do a prescribed burn, we would do environmental assessments, site assessments beforehand. We might do nesting bird surveys if it's during the nesting bird season to try to determine if there are any active nests in the area, and we would need to avoid those. There are different requirements for private landowners, but you know, a lot of the prescribed burns that really take place out of the nesting bird season. So maybe winter or late fall is a good season. And most of the burn units most of the prescribed burns that I've been on, people have gone through and prepared the burn unit first. And so I think a lot of wildlife has been flushed from the area first. So I haven't seen personally much impact, like direct impact on wildlife. Now, in terms of habitat, there can be huge benefits to the area in terms of habitat. So a lot of areas are invaded by things like broom, Scotch broom and French broom, which is a really invasive disturbance-loving species. And once it gets into a site, it can take over that site and be kind of a monoculture. There are a lot of invasive plants like that. And so doing this work to try to remove, and broom is a really rough one to get rid of, but doing this work to remove invasive species can really improve wildlife habitat for terrestrial species, and then also fish as well. There are Native American tribes in Northern California that talk about doing prescribed burns, bringing their, they don't call them prescribed burns, but bringing cultural burns back to their lands and then re-watering the landscape. So all of these very thirsty plants and say invasive Doug firs can be very thirsty. And once you do a little tending, kind of gardening through prescribed fire and other techniques, you end up seeing more water in your creeks. You end up seeing salmon returning to areas that were too dry before. And so there's this kind of celebration around rewatering their creeks and streams. So there can be some really huge benefits to these lands. I think one of the things that we all have to wrap our head around is that the landscape that we see now is not a wild and unimpacted landscape. It's been impacted by non-native plants, traditional kind of ranching practices, and a lack of fire. And so we've done such a great job of suppressing fire that we've really changed these landscapes. And so leaving it alone is not necessarily the best path forward because it's not a natural system anymore, that we need to do a little tending.
It is just like you are reading these students' minds because you guys are giving such perfect segues into the next question. But unfortunately, our event is basically over. So we had some great questions that we didn't get to about involvement of Native American groups, about nitrogen fixing species for Mike, about Lake Sonoma and landowners and working with them. So I think that we can try, if that's all right with you guys, to answer some of those questions by email and send out those answers to everybody after the event. Would that work for you too?
Yeah.
That'd be great. So we get
Sure,
to those
absolutely.
questions. So I'm going to hand this over to Daniel to do a quick wrap up on his end, and then I'll say a few words.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much to our speakers and audience for attending this program. As a high school student myself, such events have been super helpful as they have shown me snapshots into the lives of STEM professionals, showing real life examples of various science-focused jobs, allowing students like me to gain a more concrete grasp on some of these more complicated fields. Many times, such presentations provided a great opportunity for me as a visual learner to understand complex theoretical science jobs better by being able to see how the work is really done and what a typical professional day would look like in any of these fields. As I go off to college, I will now have a deeper grasp of many scientific vocations, allowing me to make more educated course selections and potential career choices in the future. All thanks to the programs such as the Mind of a Scientist program with the Sonoma Library or the program we have today. Be sure to check out more Mind of a Scientist events every Wednesday at 12:30 p.m. You can get Zoom info and learn more about each presenter at sonomalibrary.org/Mind of a Scientist, and we will put that into the chat for you right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It has been such a pleasure working with him on this event, a high school student who just stepped right up into one of these programs. It's been amazing. And I want to thank the speakers, Mike Cohen and Krelock, Ben Ehrmantraut. I want to also thank the virtual field for inspiring live from the field events, and to the Sonoma Library and all the people that helped make this happen. So if you registered today for the event, then we will send up a follow-up email. So we'll have those answers to questions we didn't get to, a resources document with articles and web links for information about these organizations and projects, and also a link to the recording. You can find recordings of past events with the Center for Environmental Inquiry at cei.sonoma.edu/calendar. And I'm going to put that in the chat in a minute. And I also want to say we still have 6 events this semester. So if you want to come see more things we're doing, we've got more for you. Next Monday is the beginning of Earth Week. We have an event about nature and mindfulness. Then after that, we have the Sudden Oak Death Blitz, which is a really great way of actually getting outside into nature because you can go collect leaves and send them into the lab for testing for free. And then for people who are interested in more in water issues, on May 8th, we have a student-led showcase of research that was done on homelessness and water, which is a really complicated topic. And there's a lot of community organizations that have been involved in that. So I'm going to paste some of these into the chat, and we really hope to see you at these events and others soon. And contact me if you have any needs. My email is also being put into the chat. Thank you so much again. Have a great rest of your day. And if I could have all of the panelists just wave goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all so much. Have a great one.